Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into the really fascinating, sometimes quite surprising world of how we judge things, our intuition, and how we make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a whole stack of sources here, research, analysis, experiments, that kind of give us a window into how our minds are working, a lot of it without us even noticing.
That's right. And our mission really in this deep dive is to unpack the consistent patterns, the errors people make over and over,
Yeah.
and explore what's really driving our choices, even when we think, oh, I'm being totally rational here.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to look at the mind's, let's say, fast, automatic side versus the slower, more effortful way of thinking.
And see how this split leads to these predictable biases that kind of subtly shape everything, from just everyday perceptions right up to, huge life choices.
Okay, so where do we start? How do we frame this?
Well, a really useful starting point from the sources is this idea of the mind having basically two systems of operation. They're often called System 1 and System 2.
Okay, like two nodes. So system one first.
Yeah, System 1, that's the automatic one. It's fast, it's intuitive, it works pretty much effortlessly.
So that's like understanding a simple sentence
Hmm.
or recognizing a face.
Exactly. Or driving a car on an empty road, you're not really thinking about the mechanics. Or even just that gut feeling, that sense of dread maybe when you see something that feels off.
Right. And it's good at seeing simple connections, like if a bunch of things look the same.
Yeah, it picks up simple relations like that easily. And it's really good at taking all the information you have about one specific thing or one person and integrating it instantly.
But it's not so great when things get more complicated, like comparing lots of different things or statistics.
No, it struggles there. Comparing multiple distinct things on different features or handling complex statistical data, that's not its strength. And it's also described as being a bit gullible. It tends to just believe what it's presented with initially.
Okay, bias towards belief, Gus. So then there's system two.
System 2. This is the other side. It's effortful, it's slow, it's deliberate. It's the part of your mind that you consciously engage.
So this needs attention. It takes work.
Definitely. This is what you use when you need to follow, say, complex instructions, or compare two products based on several features, or make a really carefully thought out choice.
Like choosing a mortgage or something.
Right. Or even simpler things like deliberately focusing your attention. System 2 is what lets you adopt what the sources call task sets.
Task sets.
Yeah, like if I told you to read this page but count every single time the letter F appears.
Okay, that would be hard. I'd have to really concentrate.
Exactly. You'd be programming your mind to override your normal reading habit. That's System 2 taking control. It's deeply involved in executive function, what we generally think of as intelligence.
But it's not limitless, right? You said it takes effort.
Absolutely a crucial point. System 2 gets tired. It can be overloaded if you try to do too much at once. And frankly, it can just be lazy sometimes. It avoids work if it can.
So how do they work together then? System one and system two, is it like they're constantly battling it out?
Not really battling. It's more like System 1 is always on, always generating stuff in the background.
Stuff like what?
Ideas, impressions, feelings, assessments about everything that's going on around you automatically.
Okay.
System 2 is kind of monitoring this stream. It can step in, direct attention if something surprising happens, search your memory if you're asked a question, or even, pose questions to itself.
And it needs to be deliberately switched on for the hard stuff.
Pretty much. For complex tasks, or if System 1 makes a suggestion that feels wrong or needs checking, you need to consciously engage System 2. And here's the key dynamic. System 2 often it often starts by accepting whatever System 1 suggests.
Ah, so it's more like an editor than the first draft writer?
That's a great way to put it. System 1 writes the quick first draft. System 2 might edit it, but only if it puts in the effort.
Okay, so system one is fast, efficient. Yeah. But you mentioned errors. What's the downside of all this speed?
Well, the downside is these predictable, systematic errors, biases. Because System 1 uses shortcuts, heuristics, rules of thumb to be so fast. It's prone to making specific kinds of mistakes. And they're not random. They're baked into how the system operates.
Right. That's where it gets really fascinating. Our automatic thinking isn't just helpful. It steers us wrong in predictable ways. Let's dive into some of these System 1 shortcuts and the biases they create.
Okay. One really common one is how our first impression of something or someone just colors everything else.
The halo effect. I think I know this one. Like you meet someone, they look good, seem really confident,
Yeah.
and you just automatically assume their ideas must be smart too, even before you've really heard them out.
Precisely. That initial positive judgment casts a halo, and it biases how you interpret everything that comes after. The sources point out that just having the name halo effect helps you spot it.
Okay, that makes sense. The quick linking of things,
Yeah.
this seems core to System 1.
It absolutely is. That associative thinking, making connections effortlessly, it often happens silently, beneath conscious awareness. We really know less about ourselves than we think.
Okay, so System 1 connects things, likes things easy. What about when it just goes with what's easiest to remember?
That leads straight to the availability heuristic. This is a classic System 1 shortcut. It basically swaps a hard question like, how frequent is this thing, for an easier one? How easily can I think of examples?
Ah, right. The sources have that example about the letter K, asking people if K appears more often as the first letter of a word or the third letter.
Exactly. And your System 1, well, it finds it much easier to recall words that start with K, kangaroo, kitchen, key.
Yeah, they come easily.
But thinking of words with K as the third letter, like acknowledge, ask, bake, that's much harder work.
So, because starting words are more available mentally.
You overestimate their frequency. People consistently think K is more common at the start, even though statistically is much more common in the third position. Ease of recall gets mistaken for frequency.
Wow. And this isn't just letters, right? The sources mention that idea about politicians maybe having more affairs than doctors or lawyers.
Yeah, that anecdote. Your first reaction might be, well, maybe.
Yeah, it feels plausible somehow.
But the availability heuristic offers another explanation. Scandals involving politicians get way more media coverage. Those stories are highly available in your memory.
Ah, I see. So it feels more common just because you hear about it more often, not necessarily because it is more common.
Exactly. System 1 goes with the readily available information, the easily recalled instances.
So System 1 likes things easy, familiar, and it makes a coherent story, even if the information is a bit skewed or limited.
Precisely. And that brings us to cognitive ease. Think of it like a dial in your mind. When System 1 is running smoothly, things feel easy. Processing is fluent.
And that feels good.
Yeah, it feels pleasant. It signals that things are probably okay, the environment is safe. And when things feel easy and safe, System 2 tends to relax.
That's its guard down.
Right. And that state of cognitive ease is linked to feeling more intuitive, maybe more creative, but also more gullible, more likely to accept System 1 suggestions without checking.
And the opposite, cognitive strain.
That feels unpleasant. It signals there might be a problem, something requires more attention. It leads to vigilance, suspicion, a more analytical approach. It basically forces System 2 to wake up and put in some effort.
Okay, here's something from the sources I found really striking about this ease thing. Familiarity feels like truth.
Yes, that's a huge one. Just repeating a statement, even a completely false or arbitrary one, makes it feel more familiar over time.
Like the example, the body temperature of a chicken. Just hearing it repeatedly.
Exactly. The more you hear it, the more familiar and easy to process it becomes. And System 1 can mistake that comfortable feeling of familiarity for a signal that the statement is actually true.
Wow. And that feeling of familiarity can also trick us into thinking we know things we don't, like that becoming famous overnight idea.
Right. The experiment they describe is fascinating. People see a list of made-up names. Just read them once.
Okay.
Then a few days later, they see another list. This one has those same made-up names mixed in with names of actual minor celebrities.
And what happens?
Because the made-up names now feel vaguely familiar. System 1 registers having encountered them before. People often misidentify them as being famous.
Just based on that feeling, not actual knowledge.
Just the feeling. System 1 substitutes the sense of, I've seen this before, for this person must be famous. It's another shortcut. And speaking of shortcuts, System 1 loves to jump to conclusions based on whatever information is immediately available.
Ah, the WISID thing. What you see is all there is.
Exactly. System 1 takes the information it has, however limited or biased it might be, and instantly constructs the most coherent story possible from it.
And crucially, the amount or quality of the information doesn't really affect how confident System 1 feels in that story.
Not much, no. If I tell you a potential leader is just intelligent and strong, your System 1 probably paints a pretty positive picture and feels quite confident about it.
Right. It doesn't automatically prompt me to ask, yeah, but are they honest? Are they compassionate? What am I missing?
Precisely. The system works with what's visible and ignores what's not. The sources mention studies where people get only one side of a legal case. They form strong opinions with high confidence based just on that incomplete picture. That's WISID in action.
It seems like System 1 is also just constantly doing these background checks, these basic assessments.
It is, yeah. Effortlessly. It's always registering things like similarity, how alike are these two things, or causality, did A cause B, or availability. How easy is it to think of examples?
And these easy answers get used.
They get substituted. When System 2 is asked a harder question, System 1 often just slips in the answer to one of these easier, basic assessments it's already made.
So instead of asking the difficult question, how competent is this politician really? My System 1 might just answer the easier question, how much do I like the look of their face?
Exactly. Judging competence from facial features like a strong chin or a confident smile, even though those things have basically zero predictive value, that's substitution. And it connects to the affect heuristic, too.
Affect heuristic.
Yeah, that's where your gut feeling your like or dislike, generated quickly by System 1, determines your beliefs about something's risks and benefits. If you feel good about, say, nuclear power, you'll tend to judge its risks as low and benefits as high. If you dislike it, you'll do the opposite. Your feeling substitutes for a complex analysis.
And this fast system, System 1, it's also obsessed with finding causes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Our associative machinery is fundamentally wired to look for causal links. Why did this happen? What caused that?
Which can clash with
Yeah.
just statistics.
Randomness.
Big time. Statistics deal with regularities, with what could have happened just by chance over the long run. But our minds want specific causes for specific events. So that's why we see patterns everywhere, even in random coin flips. Or streaks in sports, like the hot hand in basketball.
Totally. You see a player make 3 shots in a row, and System 1 screams, he's on fire. He has a cause for success right now. It struggles to accept it could just be random fluctuation within their normal skill level.
The sources mention that coach, Red Auerbach, dismissing the study that found no statistical evidence for the hot hand.
Yeah, he apparently said something like, who is this guy? So he made a study. I couldn't care less. His lifetime of seeing streaks as System 1 interpretation was just more compelling to him than the statistical data about randomness.
That drive to see patterns, to match things to stereotypes, that brings us back to the representativeness heuristic, doesn't it? Especially for judging probability.
Yes. Here, System 1 swaps the hard probability question, how likely is this, with an easier similarity question. How much does this situation, or person, resemble my stereotype or mental model?
The classic example is Steve, described as shy, meek, tidy, loves detail. Is he more likely to be a librarian or a farmer?
And intuitively, people jump to librarian because the description fits the stereotype so well.
Right.
But they completely ignore the crucial statistical fact of the base rate. There are vastly more farmers in the world than male librarians. Relying only on how representative the description is leads you to ignore the underlying probabilities. That's base rate neglect.
The CAB problem study highlights this too, right? How the base rate is used depends on how it's presented.
Exactly. If you just give people the statistic 15% of cabs in the city are blue, 85% are green, they often ignore it when they get an eyewitness account, even an unreliable one.
But if you frame it causally,
Like, the blue cab company operates 15% of the cabs, but they cause 85% of the accidents involving cabs at night. Suddenly, people pay much more attention to the base rate. System 1 loves a causal story. It makes the base rate feel more relevant.
okay, another related bias seems to be ignoring how many examples you're looking at. Insensitivity to sample size.
Right, sometimes called the belief in the law of small numbers. Our intuition tells us that even a small sample-like results from just a few people should reflect the properties of the whole population just as reliably as a large sample.
But statistically, that's just not true. Small samples are way more variable.
Way more. They're much more likely to produce extreme results just by chance. The kidney cancer example from the sources is perfect for this. You find the counties with the very highest and the very lowest rates of kidney cancer are often small rural counties.
And System 1 jumps to a causal explanation. Must be the clean rural lifestyle, or must be the poor rural diet.
Exactly. When the real reason is probably just statistical variation. Small samples are prone to extreme outcomes, both high and low.
Okay, one more System 1 classic before we move on. The conjunction fallacy.
Ah, yes. The Linda problem. Famous, controversial even.
So Linda's described as, very bright, outspoken, concerned with discrimination and social justice, participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations.
A typical activist profile from that era.
Right. Then you ask, is Linda more likely to be A, a bank teller, or B, a bank teller and active in the feminist movement?
And logically, option B has to be less probable than option A because it requires 2 conditions to be true instead of just 1. Anyone who is a feminist bank teller is also, by definition, a bank teller.
Makes sense.
But overwhelmingly, people choose B. Why? Because bank teller and feminist is much more representative of the description of Linda than just bank teller alone. System 1's desire for a coherent, representative story overrides basic probability logic.
And the sources said people really push back on this, like, so what? That's just how it seems.
Yeah, it really highlighted the power of intuitive judgments over logical rules for many people. It showed how deeply ingrained these System 1 heuristics are. It caused quite a stir.
Okay, so System 1, fast, intuitive, associative, uses shortcuts, prone to biases like availability, representativeness, WASIAD, halo effect. But what about System 2, the effortful one? We think of it as the rational one. Does it have limits beyond just being lazy?
Oh, definitely. Its main currency is effort, and effort is costly. Mentally demanding tasks aren't just feelings. They have measurable physiological effects.
Like your pupils dilating, your heart rate going up?
Exactly. The sources describe pupillometry studies where pupil size directly tracks mental load. When you're doing hard mental arithmetic or trying to hold several digits in memory, your pupils get significantly larger.
There was that amazing anecdote about literally watching someone's pupils shrink the moment they gave up on a hard task.
Yeah.
Like a window to the soul, showing the effort just vanishing.
Right. It's a real measurable cost. And that effort can actually make you temporarily blind to other things.
Blind.
There was an experiment where people had to do a really demanding task, like continuously adding 1 to digits flashed on a screen, mentally taxing.
Okay.
While they were deep in concentration, the letter K would flash briefly on the same screen.
And they didn't see it.
Often, no. Completely missed it, even though they were technically looking right at it. Especially if it flashed when their mental effort was peaking on the main task. It's like the invisible gorilla effect focused mental effort consumes your attention resources.
Wow. And because it's effortful, System 2 likes to take the easy way out, the law of least effort.
That's the idea. We're wired to avoid unnecessary cognitive strain. If there's an easier way to think about something, or if System 1 offers a plausible, quick answer, we tend to go with that rather than exert System 2.
This sounds like it connects to willpower too, the idea of ego depletion.
Yes, exactly. The research suggests that exerting self-control or voluntary effort in any domain, cognitive, emotional, physical, draws on a shared limited resource, like a mental energy budget.
So if I spend all morning resisting the urge to check my phone,
You might find it harder to concentrate on a complex problem in the afternoon. Or if you have to force yourself to be polite to someone difficult, you might have less willpower later to resist a tempting dessert.
it's all connected.
It seems to be. Stifling emotions makes you less able to withstand physical pain shortly after. Resisting tempting food makes you give up faster on a difficult cognitive puzzle. When System 2 is depleted, it has less energy to override impulses, check facts, or exert self-control. It becomes more passive, more accepting of System 1.
Which leads to what you called intellectual sloth.
Well, yeah, in a way, it's not necessarily laziness in character, but a functional laziness of System 2. People are often satisfied with the first plausible answer that comes to mind from System 1 and don't invest the extra effort needed for System 2 to really question it or check its logic.
The cognitive reflection test gets at this, right? Those tricky questions with intuitive wrong answers.
Precisely. People who score low on that test tend to go with the immediate, intuitive, but wrong answer. They're often found to be more impulsive, more impatient, seeking immediate rewards. They're less likely to engage System 2 to doubt their intuition.
Whereas higher scores,
They're more likely to be engaged, as the sources put it. They pause, they doubt the obvious answer, they invest the mental effort to work through the logic. They're more willing to use System 2.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. How do these two systems and their biases affect how we make predictions and evaluate things?
Yeah.
Especially looking back or looking forward.
Right. A huge concept here, often missed, is regression to the mean.
Regression to the mean
Yeah.
sounds statistical.
It is, but it has massive real-world implications. Basically, if you observe an extreme performance or outcome, unusually good or unusually bad the next time you measure it, it's statistically likely to be closer to the average.
Regardless of anything you did in between.
Largely, yes. Random factors contribute to extreme outcomes. Those same random factors probably won't all line up the same way next time, so things tend to drift back towards the average.
The flight instructor's story from the sources illustrated this perfectly.
Yeah, the instructor noticed that when he praised pilots for exceptionally smooth landings, their next landing was usually worse.
And when he yelled at them after a really bad landing.
Their next one was usually better, so he concluded, quite logically from his perspective, that shouting works and praise is counterproductive.
But he was actually just observing regression.
Exactly. The super smooth landing was likely a combination of skill and some luck or favorable conditions. The next landing was just more likely to be closer to the pilot's typical skill level. Same for the bad landing, probably some skill issues plus some bad luck. The next one reverted closer to the average. He mistook the statistical effect for the effect of his feedback.
And this happens whenever things aren't perfectly correlated.
Yeah.
Which is almost always.
Pretty much always in complex systems like human performance. But our intuitive predictions, driven by System 1, usually ignore regression.
How so?
We tend to predict the future based directly on the extremity of the present evidence. If a rookie has an amazing first year, our intuition predicts they'll be even better next year. We don't instinctively factor in the statistical likelihood that their performance might regress closer to a more average level.
So we get overly optimistic about high performers and maybe too pessimistic about low performers initially.
Often, yes. We fail to account for that statistical pull towards the average. And this ties into something called the illusion of validity.
Delusion of validity. Okay,
Well,
what's that?
It's our unjustified confidence in our own predictions, especially when the story feels coherent. If we have a rich, detailed description of someone that fits a stereotype perfectly,
Like the shy librarian type.
right, we feel very confident predicting they'll behave exactly according to that stereotype, even if we intellectually know that personality descriptions are actually quite poor predictors of specific behaviors or job success.
So the confidence comes from the coherence of the story in our head, System 1, not from the actual predictive power of the evidence.
Precisely. The sources use the Mueller-Lyer illusion analogy, those lines with the arrows. You know the lines are the same length, you can measure them, but you still see them as different. Similarly, you might know that unstructured job interviews have terrible predictive validity, but when you interview someone who gives you a really strong positive or negative feeling, you can't help but feel confident in your specific prediction about them. The feeling of confidence persists despite the knowledge.
And this is a major reason why simple algorithms often beat human experts at prediction tasks.
A huge reason. The sources mention around 200 studies comparing expert clinical or intuitive prediction versus simple statistical formulas.
And the algorithms win.
Overwhelmingly, or at least high. And they're cheaper and more consistent. There are almost no validated cases where human intuition consistently outperforms a decent algorithm in predictable environments.
The APGAR score for newborns is a great example, right? A simple checklist.
Perfect example. Developed decades ago, still used. A simple score based on 5 objective signs right after birth. It provides a consistent standard, predicts infant health better than doctors' subjective judgments at the time, and significantly reduced mortality by ensuring timely intervention.
And that Army interview story, too. Simple ratings beat the overall feel of the interviewer.
Yes. They had interviewers rate recruits on 6 specific factual traits during the interview. A simple sum of those 6 ratings predicted future performance better than the interviewer's own holistic, intuitive judgment formed after the whole conversation. The experts hated it, of course. Felt dehumanizing. But the numbers were clear.
Okay, what about looking back? Evaluating things after they've happened, we messed that up too.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Hindsight bias, the I knew it all along effect.
Right. Once something happens, it seems obvious in retrospect.
Exactly. We overestimate how predictable an event actually was before it occurred. The sources mention surveys done before Nixon's trips to China and Russia, asking people the probability.
And after the trips happened.
People recalled having assigned much higher probabilities beforehand than they actually had. The actual outcome reshapes our memory of our prior beliefs.
And that makes us too confident about predicting the future.
Yes, because the past looks so neat and predictable in hindsight. We underestimate the role of luck and uncertainty.
Which probably fuels outcome bias, too. Judging a decision just by whether it turned out okay.
Definitely. If a surgeon performs a standard low-risk surgery, but a 1 in a million complication occurs, people looking back might condemn the decision as risky, ignoring that it was the most sensible choice given the information available at the time. We judge the decision by the outcome, not the process.
And this hindsight and outcome bias, they help explain why people keep believing in skill in really unpredictable areas, like stock picking.
Absolutely. Success in fields like stock picking or venture capital often involves a huge amount of luck. But when someone has a lucky streak, hindsight bias makes it look like predictable skill. We then overestimate their ability to repeat it. Performance regresses to the mean, but the illusion of skill persists.
The sources mentioned studies showing that firms labeled excellent often don't stay excellent.
Right. Performance tends to regress. Even most admired companies don't consistently outperform the market long term. And you have pundits constantly offering compelling causal explanations for past market moves after they happen, reinforcing this illusion that it was all predictable if only you were smart enough.
Okay, shifting to planning for the future. We're bad at that too. The planning fallacy.
Oh, we're notoriously bad at it. This is the pervasive tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future projects while overestimating the benefits.
Even when we know that similar projects almost always run late and over budget.
Even then, it's bizarre. System 1 focuses on our specific plan, our best-case scenario, our team's enthusiasm, the inside view. It fails to consult the statistics of similar projects, the outside view.
So the cure is to deliberately seek out that outside view. Look at the track record of comparable efforts.
That's the key recommendation. Find the distribution of outcomes for similar projects and anchor your prediction in that reality, not just your optimistic plan. Of course, optimism itself plays a role here.
The optimistic bias. You mentioned the sources call it maybe the most significant bias.
Potentially, yeah. We tend to have a generally rosy view of ourselves, our abilities, our future. We think we're better than average, less likely to experience negative events, more likely to achieve our goals. We exaggerate our ability to control things.
Which can be good, right? It motivates us.
It absolutely can be a blessing. It drives progress and resilience. But unchecked optimism is also a major source of risk-taking, poor planning, and ultimately failure and disappointment. It's a double-edged sword.
Okay, let's change gears again. How do these systems affect decisions involving value, risk, gains, losses? The kind of stuff economists study.
This is where the sources really challenge some classical economic assumptions, starting with what they call Bernoulli's error.
Bernoulli, the old mathematician. What did he get wrong?
Well, he assumed that people evaluate choices or gambles based on their final impact on their total wealth. How much money will I have in the end?
That sounds logical.
It does, but it turns out that's not how our minds actually work. The research overwhelmingly shows we evaluate outcomes based on gains and losses relative to a specific reference point. Usually that reference point is our current state, the status quo.
So it's not about the absolute level of wealth, but about the change from where we are now.
Exactly. And our attitude towards risk isn't based on how much wealth we have, but on how we feel about those gains and losses. And crucially, this is fundamental. We hate losses much more than we enjoy equivalent gains.
Loss aversion. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels good.
Significantly more, typically about twice as much, according to many studies. This asymmetry is central.
And prospect theory is the model that captures this.
Yes, prospect theory is built around these principles, decisions defined by gains and losses from a reference point, a value function that's concave for gains.
Meaning, we're risk-averse for gains, prefer a sure $50 over a 50% chance of $100.
Right, and convex for losses.
Making us risk-seeking for losses.
Yeah.
Prefer a 50% chance of losing $100 over a sure loss of $50.
Generally, yes, for moderate probabilities. And overarching everything is loss aversion. The pain of a loss looms larger than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
And this loss aversion explains things like the endowment effect.
Perfectly. The endowment effect is where simply owning something makes you value it more highly than you would if you didn't own it.
Because giving it up feels like a loss.
Exactly. The moment it becomes yours, that's the new reference point. Losing it hurts.
The mug experiment is the classic demonstration.
Yeah. Give half the people mugs, ask them the minimum price they'd sell for, ask the other half who didn't get mugs the maximum they'd pay. The sellers typically demand about twice what the buyers are willing to offer.
Just because one group feels like they're losing the mug and the other feels like they're gaining it.
Precisely. The sources do note that experienced traders show less of this, they get used to exchanging things, and they touch on the interesting idea that for the very poor, many choices are inherently between losses. Spending money here means you lose the ability to spend it there, which might make their decision-making dynamics different, perhaps more like traders, but under much harsher constraints.
So prospect theory gives us this fourfold pattern of risk attitudes. Risk-averse for gains, risk-seeking for losses.
For medium to high probabilities, yeah. But interestingly, it flips for very low probability.
Also.
For small chances of large gains, people become risk-seeking think lottery tickets. And for small chances of large losses, they become risk-averse think buying insurance. The possibilities get overweighted.
Which highlights another key thing. How choices are presented, how they're framed, really matters,
Yeah.
even if the underlying options are identical.
Absolutely. This violates the classical economic assumption of invariance that preferences shouldn't depend on the description. But framing effects are incredibly powerful.
Just describing the same situation in terms of gains versus losses can flip people's choices completely.
Completely. Or think about that example of saving $5. Are you willing to drive 20 minutes to save $5 on a $15 calculator? Most people say yes.
Okay.
Are you willing to drive 20 minutes to save $5 on a $125 jacket? Most say no.
Even though it's the same $5 saving, the same 20-minute drive?
Yep. We frame the saving relative to the item's price, the topical account not relative to our overall budget or the absolute value of $5. This narrow framing drives the decision.
And these reference points on loss aversion must be huge in negotiations.
Critical. Whatever the current terms are, become the reference point. Any concession you make feels like a loss, which hurts because of loss aversion.
So both sides feel the pain of giving something up more intensely than the pleasure of receiving it. Makes agreement hard.
Especially when dividing losses, like in bankruptcy or budget cuts, loss aversion makes those situations incredibly sticky.
Judgments of fairness seem tied to this too. What feels fair depends on your reference point, your perceived entitlement.
Definitely. Cutting wages feels much less fair if the company is profitable, violating the worker's reference point of current wages, than if the company is struggling, where sharing the loss seems more acceptable. Legal systems also often implicitly recognize loss aversion, compensating actual losses more readily than foregone gains.
Okay, what about really rare events? How do we factor those into decisions? You mentioned we overweight possibilities.
Yes, when we're thinking about rare events, especially if they're brought vividly to our attention, we tend to give them more weight than their tiny probability really deserves. This is the possibility effect.
So we worry disproportionately about, say, a highly publicized but very rare disease.
Potentially, yes. We're also pretty insensitive to small differences and small probabilities. A 1 in 100,000 risk versus a 1 in 1 million mallet risk doesn't feel that different intuitively. And we'll pay a lot extra for certainty, the certainty premium. People will pay much more to reduce a risk from, say, 1% down to 0%, complete elimination, than from 2% down to 1%, same 1% reduction.
And how the risk is presented matters too. Frequency versus probability.
Big difference. Saying 10 people out of every 10,000 get this disease sounds much scarier and gets weighted more heavily in decisions than saying a 0.1% chance. Vivid imagery and frequency formats exploit the availability heuristic and can inflate perceived risk.
This can lead to those availability cascades, where media hype creates widespread fear about a minor risk.
Exactly. A minor risk gets reported, maybe sensationally. Public concern rises. More media coverage follows. People start demanding action. Politicians respond. Policy gets made, sometimes diverting huge resources to address a statistically small problem, all driven by this cycle of availability and emotional reaction. Think Love Canal, the Allah scare on apples.
But here's the paradox you mentioned earlier. While we overweight rare events when thinking about them, we underweight them when relying on personal experience.
That's the twist. If you're deciding based on what's happened to you or people you know directly, rare events, by definition, probably haven't happened, so they don't feature in your experiential memory base.
So you act as if they're less likely than they are.
Right. If you live in California and haven't personally experienced a major earthquake, you might underweight the risk when deciding whether to prepare. If you're a banker who's never lived through a systemic financial crisis, you might underweight the probability of one happening based on your experience. Decisions from description, overweighting rare events, and decisions from experience, underweighting them, can lead to very different choices.
Wow. Okay, this leads us to another major distinction the sources make. The idea of two selves.
Yes, this is a profound one.
Yeah.
The distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Okay, break that down.
Yeah.
The experiencing self is?
The one living life moment by moment, feeling pleasure, pain, boredom, engagement. Right now, it's the stream of consciousness.
And the remembering self.
That's the storyteller, the scorekeeper. It's the self that looks back, evaluates experiences, was that a good vacation, and makes decisions for the future based on those evaluations.
And the catch is, these two selves don't always agree, because the remembering self's evaluations are flawed.
Precisely. The remembering self is subject to major biases when evaluating past experiences, most notably duration neglect and the peak end rule.
Duration neglect,
Right.
meaning how long an experience lasted doesn't matter much for how we remember it.
Astonishingly little. Whether a painful medical procedure lasted 5 minutes or 15 minutes has minimal impact on your retrospective rating of how bad it was.
So what does the remembering self pay attention to?
It focuses almost exclusively on two things: the peak intensity of the feeling, how good or bad was the best or worst moment, and the end feeling, how did it feel right at the very end. That's the peak end rule.
The cold hand experiment demonstrated this, right?
Yes, a classic. People put their hand in painfully cold water. One trial was shorter but ended abruptly at the most painful point. Another trial was longer overall, including the same painful period, but then added an extra minute where the water warmed up slightly, making the end less unpleasant.
And when asked which trial they'd prefer to repeat,
The remembering self chose the longer trial. Even though it involved more total time and pain, more suffering for the experiencing self, the less unpleasant ending created a better memory.
so the remembering self is making choices based on flawed memories, potentially condemning the experiencing self to more suffering.
That's the conflict. The self that makes decisions relies on these biased recollections. An objective observer wanting to minimize total pain would choose the shorter trial. But our remembering self optimizes for good memories, not necessarily good experiences minute by minute. Evaluating a whole life based just on its ending or ignoring duration, like in the Jen's life story example, it seems illogical, but it's how the remembering self operates.
And this split helps explain the difference between, say, moment-to-moment happiness and overall life satisfaction.
Exactly. Experienced well-being is how the experiencing self feels day to day. Life satisfaction is how the remembering self evaluates your life overall when asked to think about it.
And things like income affect them differently.
Very differently. More income boosts life satisfaction quite significantly. When you think about your life, having money makes you evaluate it more positively. But its effect on day-to-day experienced happiness plateaus much earlier. Beyond a certain point, more money doesn't make your experiencing self much happier moment to moment.
Achieving goals also seems more related to life satisfaction.
Yes. If you set out wanting to be rich and you become rich, your remembering self gives your life a high satisfaction score. You succeeded by your own metrics. But that doesn't automatically mean your experiencing self feels better each day than someone who had different goals.
Okay, one more illusion related to evaluation: the focusing illusion.
Ah, yes. This is the idea that whatever aspect of life you are currently thinking about will seem disproportionately important when you make an overall judgment. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it.
System 1 substitutes judgment about the focused on part for judgment about the whole.
Pretty much. The California climate study is the classic example. People were asked about their own happiness and also asked to rate how happy they thought people in California were, often focusing on the climate. Californians did report enjoying their climate more than, say, Midwesterners. No surprise there. But when asked about overall life satisfaction, there was no difference between Californians and Midwesterners.
So focusing on the climate made people think Californians must be happier, but in reality, climate has a very small impact on overall well-being.
Exactly. When you ask the question, the climate becomes salient, available, easy to focus on, and its importance gets vastly exaggerated in the overall judgment. System 1 grabs the easy, focused-on aspect and uses it to answer the harder, broader question.
So wrapping things up, System 1's automatic processing, it's the basis for our everyday gut feelings, right? Recognizing anger, dodging something thrown at you.
Absolutely. That's everyday intuition. An expert intuition, the chess master's immediate sense of the board, the firefighter's split-second decision that's often highly developed, System 1 pattern recognition.
Like Herbert Simon said, it's basically recognition, built up over thousands of hours.
Exactly. Intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. The expert instantly recognizes cues that access deeply learned knowledge stored in memory, all thanks to System 1's speed.
But true experts also know when not to trust their gut.
That's crucial. Real expertise involves recognizing the limits of your intuition, knowing when the situation is irregular or when you need to slow down and engage System 2's analysis. This contrasts with what the sources might call pseudo-experts, who have the intuitive confidence, the illusion of validity, without the underlying predictive accuracy.
And System 2, while lazy and effortful, can learn rules, think statistically, and override System 1 if we make it.
Yes. It requires deliberate effort, attention, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to question those powerful immediate intuitions that System 1 constantly generates.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive today through the two systems, the landscape of biases, illusions. It's quite a tour of how our minds work, or sometimes misfire.
It really is. And the key takeaway, I think, is that these are systematic patterns. They aren't random errors or personal flaws. They're features of the human cognitive machine.
Understanding things like the halo effect, availability, loss aversion, regression to the mean, hindsight bias, the two selves, gives you this richer vocabulary, doesn't it?
Definitely. A vocabulary to understand your own judgments, your own choices, and maybe be a bit more understanding or perhaps constructively critical of the judgments and choices you see others making.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given that our minds naturally operate with these shortcuts and are prone to these systematic errors, how can you actively use this knowledge? What could you do differently to make, perhaps, slightly better decisions in your own life?
And maybe think back. Is there a recent decision you made or an experience you evaluated that looks a little different now, knowing about these underlying patterns? What bias might have been quietly shaping your perspective? It's something worth reflecting on.